There comes a moment in an empath's life that doesn't feel dramatic on the outside, but internally it changes everything. It's not loud. It's not visible, but it's irreversible. This is the moment of awakening. And what most people don't tell you is that it doesn't instantly bring peace. It brings separation. Before this shift, connection often feels natural, even effortless. You give, you listen, you adjust. You become what others need, sometimes without even realizing it. You build friendships, relationships, and social circles based on shared time, shared history, or shared convenience. But beneath all of that, there's a quiet discomfort that many empaths learn to ignore, a sense that something isn't fully aligned. Awakening removes your ability to ignore it. You begin to notice things you once overlooked. The inconsistency in people's words and actions. The subtle manipulation hidden behind charm. The way some conversations leave you drained rather than fulfilled. You don't become more judgmental. You become more aware. And awareness changes your tolerance. This is where the separation begins. It's not that people suddenly turn against you. It's that you stop participating in dynamics that were never healthy to begin with. You stop laughing at things that don't feel right. You stop over-explaining yourself just to maintain comfort. You stop carrying emotional weight that was never yours. And as you do this, something interesting happens. The connections that were built on those old patterns start to weaken. This is often misinterpreted as loss. But it's not loss. It's alignment. Most people are comfortable operating at a surface level because it's predictable. It's safe. It doesn't require introspection or vulnerability. But an awakened empath no longer has the ability to stay there. Depth becomes your default. You begin to seek honesty over harmony, truth over comfort. And not everyone is willing or able to meet you in that space. So the distance grows. Conversations feel shorter. Interactions feel forced. You start to recognize that what once felt like connection was often proximity, habit, or mutual need. And when those layers fall away, you're left with a reality that can feel unsettling at first. You're not as surrounded as you thought you were. This is the point where many people become uncomfortable. Because from the outside, it can look like isolation. It can look like withdrawal. But internally, something very different is happening. You're no longer confusing presence with connection. You're no longer mistaking attention for understanding. You're becoming precise. And precision requires letting go of what doesn't fit. There's also a psychological shift that takes place here that's worth understanding. When you're deeply empathetic but not yet awakened, your identity is often tied to how well you can maintain relationships. You measure your value by how needed you are, how appreciated you feel, how well you can keep the peace. But awakening disrupts that framework entirely. You begin to see that constantly adapting to others isn't connection, it's self-abandonment. And once you see that clearly, you can't go back. So you start choosing differently. You choose silence over forced conversation. You choose distance over emotional confusion. You choose authenticity over acceptance. And while those choices are healthier, they also come with consequences. Not everyone understands them. Not everyone respects them. Some people interpret your change as rejection, when in reality, it's recognition. You're recognizing what is real and what is not. And that recognition creates space. Now, here's the part that matters most. This space is not a punishment. It's a recalibration. It's where your standards reset. It's where your perception sharpens. It's where you begin to understand that connection is not about quantity. It's about congruence. You're no longer asking who is around me. You're asking who actually sees me. That question alone will change your entire social reality. Because when you operate from that level of awareness, you naturally become more selective, not out of arrogance but out of clarity. You're no longer willing to invest energy into relationships that require you to shrink, perform, or compromise your truth. And as a result, your circle becomes smaller or sometimes temporarily non-existent. And this is where many empaths doubt themselves. They wonder if they've become too distant, too guarded, too different. But the truth is far simpler. You've become accurate. You're no longer projecting meaning onto empty interactions. You're no longer holding on to connections out of fear of being alone. You're seeing things as they are, not as you hoped they would be. And while that level of clarity can feel isolating at first, it's also the foundation of something far more powerful: sovereignty. Because when you stop forcing connection, you create the conditions for real connection to exist. And that's the paradox. Awakening may initially leave you with fewer people, but it aligns you with the right ones or prepares you to recognize them when they appear. It removes the noise so you can finally hear what's genuine. So if you find yourself in this phase where your circle is shrinking, where interactions feel different, where solitude is becoming more familiar, understand what's actually happening. You're not losing people, you're losing illusions. And in that process, you're gaining something far more valuable than temporary connection. You're gaining truth. And once you see the truth clearly, you'll never again confuse being surrounded with being understood. Once that initial separation takes place, something subtle but powerful begins to shift in the way an awakened empath relates to their own emotional depth. What once felt overwhelming, almost like a liability, starts to reorganize itself into something far more structured. You're no longer drowning in what you feel. You're learning how to read it. Before this stage, emotional sensitivity often operates without direction. You pick up on everything, the moods of a room, the tension behind someone's smile, the unspoken dynamics in a conversation. But without clarity, it becomes exhausting. You absorb, you process, and you carry more than you should. That's why many empaths initially describe their depth as a burden. It feels like too much information with no way to filter it. But awakening changes the function of that sensitivity. It introduces discernment, and that's the distinction most people miss. Sensitivity without discernment leads to overwhelm. Sensitivity with discernment becomes precision. You begin to realize that not everything you feel is yours to hold. And more importantly, not everything you perceive deserves your engagement. This is where emotional depth transforms into a filter. You start noticing patterns, not just emotions. You see how people respond under pressure, how consistent they are over time, how their behavior aligns or doesn't with what they claim to value. You're no longer reacting to isolated moments. You're observing systems of behavior. And once you start thinking in patterns, your decision-making changes. You don't need dramatic events to tell you something is off. Subtle inconsistencies are enough. A slight shift in tone, a repeated contradiction, an energy that feels performative rather than genuine. These are small signals, but to an awakened empath, they're data points. And over time, those data points form a clear picture. You don't have to confront everything. You don't have to explain everything. You simply adjust your level of access. That's what filtering really means. It's not about building walls or becoming emotionally unavailable. It's about becoming selective with your presence. You're no longer offering your time, your attention, or your emotional investment indiscriminately. You're choosing where it goes. And that choice is based on alignment, not obligation. This is also the stage where the need for external validation begins to dissolve. Before awakening, there's often a subtle dependency on how others respond to you, their approval, their recognition, their inclusion. It all plays a role in how you measure connection. But as your emotional depth becomes more refined, that dependency weakens. You stop asking, "Did they accept me?" And you start asking, "Do I trust what I'm seeing?" That shift is critical because validation is external and unstable. It changes based on context, mood, and perception. But discernment is internal and consistent. It's built on observation, pattern recognition, and self-trust. And once you begin to rely on that, your relationships naturally recalibrate. You're no longer drawn to intensity alone. You're drawn to consistency. You're no longer impressed by words. You're attentive to behavior. You're no longer trying to decode every mixed signal. You recognize that clarity doesn't need interpretation. And this is where your emotional depth becomes protective, not defensive protective. There's a difference. Defensiveness reacts out of fear. Protection operates from awareness. You're not assuming the worst about people. You're simply no longer ignoring what's clearly in front of you. And because of that, you conserve your energy. You avoid unnecessary entanglements. You step back before something becomes draining instead of after. This is a level of control that most people never develop. Not because they lack intelligence, but because they avoid discomfort. Discernment requires you to face uncomfortable truths about people and sometimes about yourself. It requires you to admit when something isn't working, even if it's familiar, even if it's convenient. And that's where most people hesitate. But an awakened empath doesn't have that luxury anymore. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Once you recognize misalignment, you can't comfortably participate in it. So, your filter becomes stronger, not out of preference, but out of necessity. You begin to understand that your emotional depth is not there to make you endlessly available. It's there to make you accurately responsive. It allows you to engage fully when something is real and withdraw completely when it's not. It gives you range but also restraint. And that balance is what creates stability. You're no longer swinging between overinvolvement and complete withdrawal. You're operating with intention. You know when to lean in and when to step back. You know when something deserves your energy and when it doesn't. And that clarity removes a significant amount of internal conflict because confusion is often the result of ignoring what you already know. Now, as this filter strengthens, your external world may continue to shift. You may find that fewer people remain in your immediate circle, not because you've become distant, but because you've become accurate. You're no longer maintaining connections out of habit or history. You're maintaining them based on alignment. And alignment is rare. But here's the part that matters. This rarity is not something to fear. It's something to respect. Because when your filter is clear, when your discernment is sharp, every connection that does remain carries more substance. It's not built on convenience. It's built on congruence. And even in moments where there are no connections meeting that standard, there's no urgency to lower it. Because you understand something most people overlook. The cost of the wrong connection is always higher than the discomfort of no connection at all. So your emotional depth, once perceived as a burden, becomes one of your greatest assets. It guides you. It protects you. It refines your environment until only what is real can remain. And when you reach that level of clarity, you stop trying to feel less. You start trusting what you feel because you finally understand what it's showing you. As this filtering process strengthens, something else begins to emerge. Something that most people misunderstand when they see it from the outside. They call it isolation. They assume something is missing. But internally for the awakened empath, it feels very different. It feels like order because what used to be filled with noise, constant